Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Catherine Bennett.
I'm Gavin Eshonton.
And we're delighted to be joined today by Douglas Haugen, Dr. Douglas Haugen, scholar, author, whose academic journey has spanned across some of the finest institutions in the US, and author of this wonderful book that Gavin and I have picked up recently and are making our way through. We'd definitely say grab a copy, wouldn't we, Gavin, if you can? It's called In Pursuit of the Metaverse: Millennial Dreams, Political Religion, and Techno-Utopia. And I must say, and look, I've been reading through it, I've still some way to go, but it's fantastic. And the bibliography is really broad. And it did bring to mind, not to have a dig at our Holy Father this early on, it would be it would be a bit early even for us, Gavin, but it did bring to mind Fiducia Supplicans, which was very self-referential. And here, Dr.
We're seeing common people around the world becoming supernatural when they follow this formula. They're healing themselves, they're creating new jobs, new opportunities, and they look just like you.
En mi trabajo no me cubren el seguro médico, pero encontré un plan de salud de calidad por $0 al mes.
4 de cada 5 consumidores pueden encontrar un plan de salud por $10 o menos al mes con ayuda financiera en cuidadodesalud.gov. Inscríbete hoy.
Doug Haugen has a really extensive bibliography, and it's so well researched, from the Church Fathers to political figures, and it's a brilliant book and deep analysis of the culture, the problems going on at the moment. And I want to say, Doug, that as we approach Christmas, the incarnation, we know that this is key, that Christ reconciles heaven and earth in his body. And I really want to get into this idea of the body with you and the importance of the body. And without a right theology of the body, we're lost and swept up in false ideas and moved away from reality. So it's only through the church, it's only through the Catholic Church that we can apprehend reality. And this is something that you're able to explain in much more depth in your book. But we've asked you here today in this lead up to Christmas to talk about that. And maybe we'll begin with a nice simple question, Doug, like, so what is reality?
Yeah, it's a good one. And what I'm going to do is actually read from my favorite 20th century philosopher, Eric Voegelin, for this. And he was technically never a Catholic, but really taught me how to, from a philosophical lens, how to understand what eventually I found was the mystical body of Christ and the Catholic Church. So he, okay, like when we just ask this anecdotally to somebody like, what is reality, or get real? That was a big expression when I was a kid, like, reality's calling, and some people are not in tune with reality. And I have a starting point sometimes that I say, we right now, and perhaps we've always been, we're under attack. There's an ontological war on reality. So the word ontological means being, and that's always connected philosophically with God. And God is pure being. The further we get away from God, the further we get away from reality. And so God can't be evil. So the more evil we get, the more we get away from God, and the more we get blinded. So with that broad definition, let me give you a philosophical definition from Eric Voegelin. And he's going to start out in the classical Greek and Christian description, the context, and that's important here, the context in which human existence is actually experienced. Because I'm going to use that term a couple times, actual experience versus sort of a simulated experience. So when we're actually existent, somehow we're more plugged into God. So the actual existence in which humans actually experience, which existence is actually experienced and lived. The human condition is specified by man's, here's a key word, participation in the great hierarchy of being. So there's something that's hierarchical, there's a cosmic order, so it probably extends even beyond our immediate time and space. in fact, it extends beyond and encompasses and shapes man. So it defines who we are, and it's ultimately a participatory experience. So there's a couple of key concepts there. We participate in this thing that's hierarchical, and it extends beyond even what we can immediately see. So God, the Trinity, is a unity, and that's a mystery there, how it works. But how we anchor these thoughts is this revelation given to Moses, the great I am. So I am a self-contained entity. And of course, for Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, this is the starting block of how we know God fundamentally exists. The first mover, the creator of everything, has to transcend his own creation. So from that Trinity, we have the incarnation. That's what we're celebrating this month. God came into this world as a child and lived among us in a body, and he suffered with his body. He died. 3 days later, he arose from the dead and is sitting at the right hand of the Father. And that's what we call beatific vision. And this sews this all together in this concept called an image. So we can use that. We have grounding in God being the great I am, and we have an image of the Son coming in and opening up this doorway back to the Father. So we're in this fallen state, and he showed us the path into heaven. So when we apprehend in the post-Christian world, now we have two frames of reality. We have the transcendent, something that's beyond our sort of time prison and space prison, and yet a God that came down and lived among us and tied us back and gave us a pathway back to the pureness of reality. So we're living in, I think, what Gavin would probably call a sort of an eschatology that sort of we're halfway there. We're already, but
semi-realized.
Yes, an inaugurated eschatology. So
yes, that's better.
Yes. So the body that we concentrate on, at one time, some people can get overly material, the modern world, and there is no transcendent reality of the naturalized, the physicalized. And sometimes people can get a little bit too spiritual. And I found this out yesterday with the debate, is the world geocentric or is it heliocentric? And people arguing about that get inside of attention. And I'm realizing that's a mystery. So the center point of this is the word mystery. So when we contemplate the mystery between the heaven and earth, Plato called this middle spot the metaxy. And I think when we talk about the word mystery, we could talk about the mystery of the Trinity, the mystery of the Incarnation, the mystery of the Eucharist. But centrally, this is what ties together the frames of reality that we hold. And this is best bridged through the mystical body of Christ that ties together his transcendent body and his mystical body that is living, it's nailed in history. So when we share in that most perfectly through his mystical body, which is the icon, which is the church, he gave us that to be best in tune with reality, because the reality is the ultimate reality that we see in the new heaven and the new earth, or the beatific vision. So we do that through the sacraments. So what I say, what the church is that offers us that nothing else does, is that it's historical. It ties us all the way back to the Garden of Eden in our fallen state. It ties us back to the old covenant, into the new covenant, and into the promise, which is the beatific vision. We have the hierarchy, and that's part of our humility, because staying in a mystery involves humility. And the church reminds us that even if people are screwing up all around us, God wants us to kind of check ourselves in the here and now. And so it makes us humble. And there's the heavens are hierarchical, and so it should be here. And the proper Christian social order would be hierarchical, ideally with a king and all of this stuff in the classical Catholic social order, which was Christendom. And finally, it's sacramental. And this is where the mystery lies, where we meditate. If we're not actually in Mass, we're not participating with others, but we're participating with the millennial kingdom, which is here and now, which is the church, which is the ark that's going to take us into the eternal. And so we celebrate the Mass with the mystery of communing with the saints beyond time and space. And, and finally, we literally partake in the body of Christ, which is the unity, which is the church, which brings all reality together. And the enemy, when I say in my book, there's a cosmic conspiracy in my first book, the cosmic conspiracy is exactly against that image and that mystery. It wants to take that mystery and that image and put it, we call it immanentizing the eschaton. The eschaton is that beatific vision that God says, get out of the world, stay focused, keep your eyes on the prize. And the enemy wants to pull that image and make it like we can make this perfect man-made utopia, or through science, or sometimes a fancy word is technological mediated ascension. There's always the enemy's counterfeiting Christ's mission. And so when we're able to identify it, I think it is helpful that we can see, wait a minute, this seems like it's of God, but is it pulling us away? And the key word here, I'm talking too much. The key word here with the image, I call it the Christian singularity. The enemy wants to make a technological singularity. In the Christian singularity, Christ is the head, we are the members, it's a singular body, and the touchstone to that reality is the sacraments. And so, of course, the devil wants to take those sacraments and put a worldly counterfeit thing in front of our face and dazzle us to get us chasing those things of the world. So in short, that's a little bit about reality and the church.
To be fair, it was quite a broad question. To expect you to answer it in 10 seconds is impossible. I think you did a stellar job there, don't you, Gavin?
Thank you.
I thought it was very good. You said when we can identify it. This is part of what Gavin and I spend a lot of time talking about and exploring. And we've quite often said that the sacraments are so important, and really said what you've said there. When we can identify it, it looks to me then like the Protestant Reformation, the French Revolution, communism, all of these things are, on the one hand, different things, but would it be fair to say there is a thread that runs through them all, which is that removing people from that, what you've just described, that reality as you've elucidated it?
Yes, that's the huge piece. So the devil works in alchemy. And this is this grand alchemy of taking one thing and another and moving it forward toward his vision. So he wants to take the vision, he'll take division in the body of Christ, divide it, and move it toward his vision. And a classic case of that was the Protestant Revolution. And what happened in short order was that they removed the millennial kingdom. And that's our present contact with the reality and our saints. And it's so important to get back to reality, to realize that the church is an icon, that doorway to God, and all these individual icons. And the word, like how we contact also with this vision, is the hypostatic union, to make sure we're tightly incorporated into the mystical body. And God gave us visual tools, classic icons, the church music, and all of those things, and just the silence of getting back to that vision. So that was removed by the Protestant Reformation, especially Zwingli and those people that would literally have to smash stained glass, and doing it in the name of God. You know, I'm going to be a little judgmental and say they were probably demon possessed, but so that vein of reality. And then of course it ends up becoming futurized and politicized. This eschaton now is something that has to happen. It isn't the finished work of Christ on the cross. It isn't that we're holding in this space between heaven and hell. All the work has been done. We're just remaining in space, working in grace and faith and walking through it. But no, it's something still has to be happening. So that's the politicalization of it. First, the step is just removing the visual part, the millennial kingdom, and then the political part. And that's where we get from Christendom, which is a world made fundamentally on the rights of God and Christ the King. And we get into modernity, which is a separation of church and state, which is really upside down world. And we've been working off the fumes of Christendom for a long time, but the realization of freedom of man first, think about God second, recreating God in our own mind, what's comfortable for us, number one. And finally, the world, the final frame is mass communications. And we call this part the spectacle, that we get so lost in. And I draw from the classic Colosseum of the ancient world. There's a descendant of it. I call it the empire of spectacle. It's our screens, it's the drama, it's the politics, it's the sweat, blood, and tears that's kind of pouring out for the sake of the world, not for the sake of Christ. And we get drawn into it. And scripture is so clear, if we're going to always think of the end of days, this is the beast we have to remove ourselves from. These are the kings that have drunk of the wine of the fornication. And we get drawn, the devil wants to get us drawn into all of this all the times, lesser of two evils, and a lot of things that are controversial, about getting engaged in these kind of things. So the third step right now is mass communication that's heading for artificial intelligence that wants to get under our skin and connect ourselves with, so that we're permanently connected. And I guess we could call this a type of the mark. So we're really now no longer marked by the image of God, but by the image of man, which I believe is going on in the book, The Apocalypse.
Would that be
We're trading
related
a
to the
truth
mark
for
of
life.
Cain?
Yes, yes.
Gavin, this is really pertinent to all the work that we do, and you and I both perhaps have a propensity to be drawn into the politics. You know, we're both writers. We write for news outlets, and there were riots in England over the summer, uprisings. There's whatever's going on in the Middle East. There's left and right. There's Trump and Kamala. Over here, there's Starmer, there's Boris Johnson, or whoever the other one is. I've lost track of our politicians at this stage. I suppose part of what you're saying there, Doug, is being drawn into that is part of the problem. But I suppose, Gavin, there's also that question. You know, one has to speak up about some of these horrors, like mutilation of children, or so Gavin, for example, you get involved, you said, more increasingly in politics where you never used to. Why do you do that, and why do you think that's important?
So Doug's been terribly helpful to me in the last 10 minutes, because he's put it in a framework that allows me to see more clearly. So let me answer that, and then what I want to do, if I can, is to re-articulate what Doug has said, but in slightly different words, because I think there are a number of ways of analyzing this or telling the narrative. So in answer to your first question, which is a really important one, I've been trying to explain that I've spent my life not doing politics, and suddenly I find myself having to do it. So I don't think you and I, Catherine, are being drawn into the politics. What's happened is that this thing that Doug has very helpfully called political theology has come closer and closer to us, parked its tanks on our lawn, so to speak, and it's begun to make demands on the area of personal integrity, of personal spiritual allegiance, which politics itself hasn't done for a long time. So it'd be interesting to hear Doug describe political theology, but what I understand it to be is that we have, if you like, three states of perception. One is the material one, and out of that, in the last 200 years, we've had the hedonism and atheism. So if you have a materialistic view of the universe, you have a good time, and you don't believe in any accountability, and that's to be locked into the material universe. But there's a Gnostic side, a spiritual side. Doug said all this, but I'm saying it in different words, because I think there are a number of dimensions to it. And the spiritual side of it, particularly as a Protestant, and particularly as a charismatic Protestant, is a dematerialized reading of the world in the world of the spirit. But the problem with that is that it's going to allow us to slip in to the new idolatry of AI, whose intention is to dematerialize us perpetually. And that's that. So one of the things that's happened, and the reason this is confusing, is that this has happened, I think, in the last 20 years with enormous speed. In the last 2 decades, we've shifted from the atheist hedonism through a kind of Protestant Gnosticism that's not been located in the material, as the Catholic sacraments are going to do, to allow us to skid into what Doug's called the spectacle, which is going to be the ambition of keeping ourselves spiritually, intellectually, non-materially, perpetually conscious. So what AI and the cyborg initiative is trying to do is to give us an ontological being separate from our body. And the reason this matters is that the real reality, so ultimate reality is presented to us in the fusion of matter and spirit that takes place firstly in the incarnation and secondly daily in the Mass. And the reason the Mass is so important is because it is this continuation of the principle of the incarnation, where spirit and matter are ineluctably fused. And part of my problem is that as a Protestant, I spent my life being vulnerable to a dematerialized Gnosticism that is going to make me particularly more vulnerable to the AI revolution that's coming. And what I've understood Doug to say, and I'm trying to say it in slightly different words, because I think we need to try and say this in a series of different ways so that people can grab onto it from their own perspective. The only answer to this split between matter and spirit, both of which take us into non-being, dead ends, evil, is A, the incarnation, but then only the Catholic Church, brackets, of course, the Orthodox pre-1054, only the Apostolic Church maintains this fusion that the incarnation represents of matter and spirit in the Eucharist. And that's what. And one of the things I want to ask Doug is, he's described just in passing what the Catholic antidote to political theology might be like. And I think we're going to talk about integralism, certainly this notion of monarchy and hierarchy. And if that's the case, what I expect you're going to say, and I haven't thought it through, so I'm not trying to be clever, what I expect you're going to say is that we're looking for a political system that is sufficiently restrained by the sacramental to stop it becoming the utopian political theology that Marxism, hedonism, technological revolution have become, in order to preserve this balance between matter and spirit. And the reason, to get back to Kathleen's point, is why Katherine and I are talking about political issues all the time is because this political theology has trespassed on the kingdom of heaven. It's trespassed on the life of the sacramentalized spirit. And because it's done that, we have to refute it. We're calling it out all the time. And one of the things I think will come from this is that we ought to be able to call it out as the politicization of theology, as the utterly improper ambition to create a utopia that is anti-God. And that's why we're talking about it. In the past, the reason why the Jesuits and others got very excited about liberation theology was they made the move early. They, having no metaphysics, the Eshonton, the first principle of Eshonton's metaphysics is the moment you lose metaphysics, you become political. And so the loss of metaphysics from the 1960s onwards sent the Jesuits and others scurrying into politics to meet this political theology as it was advancing. We don't need political theology anymore because political theology has arrived. So we don't need liberation theology anymore because political theology has arrived, and it's staking out its interest in utopianism, in ecology, in gender, in order to capture from Christianity an epistemological authority that says you need to understand these things in the non-ontos, the non-God way.
So the problem is to meet those political, that oncoming political wave with politics is not the answer, is the point. So if you and actually, to be fair to us, although we find ourselves commenting on the political, it is exactly as you've said, because of that overreach of the political. Look at the way politics is trying to make a claim on, it's so, human law is so far removed from natural law, where there should be coherence between the natural law, which is rooted in the divine law, and where there's not, we want to say, no, it's gone awry, rather than, no, not the left, but the right. No, not the right, but the left. But the up.
We're not saying not the left, but the right. Absolutely.
But Christ, exactly, the hypostatic union, as Doug said. And for anyone listening who may not be familiar with any of the terms or some of the terms, please don't be afraid to comment below. When we say hypostatic union, we simply mean Christ, who is fully God and fully man, not half God and half man, but fully God and fully man. So Doug, so you wanted to respond to Gavin.
Well, both of you made a lot of good points, and I think just kind of identified the issue. Both of you made good points, and the natural law leaves us to the eternal law, and how do we make sure we keep our eye on that? So I'll just kind of work backwards with a couple of the comments. In a couple hours, I'm interviewing a gentleman associated with LifeSite that just wrote a book called Navigating the Crisis, through a kind of a traditional lens. And, he's a writer like you all, so he gets involved in the writing about politics. And so I don't want to sound judgy, like, we should become Amish or, do that kind of solution. But how do we navigate a middle ground? And part of it has to do with really grounding our perception on what is going around us. We need to speak truth. We need to call out evil. But I'm not giving you an easy answer. I'm going to introduce. I think this gentleman also put his crux on it, but I do disagree. He's kind of pro Bishop Vigano, and that's just a different route. I don't buy into that deception about East and West, and I think it's part of this alchemy project. So how do we pull ourselves off from kind of the workings of the devil when we see? You all know that over there the Tories are basically doing the same job over the last decade as the Labor, and people call it out.
Yeah, they're indistinguishable.
Situation. It's going on in every country, right? And so so you just have this need to be drawn into it. And so how do we pick our battles? And I'll give you the short answer. We just have to identify it. What Gavin described here is the political theology unto transhumanism, where the system wants us to merge with another, alien entity, which is a fancy way of saying techno-demonology. It's not a good thing. So we have just obvious things. We have to see the direction of it. People that get sucked into the Trump thing and see him hanging around with Elon Musk, and he's completely 100%, a promoter of this system. And so you just can't get so sucked up into the show. So there's some obvious kind of things. But one thing that I would say is this is a consistent Gnostic thought virus that has began in the first century and is continuing in today. So when political, and Gavin just recognized that, when politics is packaged in a Gnostic form, you have to be able to identify it and kind of stick away from it. So obviously we want to protect life. We want to do the right thing. We want to, prepare a way for future generations, keep our families safe. Those are no-brainers. But the powers that be really want you to get engaged in the show, and it's difficult not to. And I can imagine if you're a writer or if you want to make content, it's difficult just to say, okay, now we're going to open up to the book of Hosea today and we're going to read. You're not going to get people have a need to get attached to the show. And so it really is staying engaged in that mystery, that fine space. And there really isn't an easy answer. But I can tell you right now, all of the kings of the earth have drunk of the wine of her fornication. And we have to be kind of, the show wants to tell us the lesser of two evils, and we sort of have to be aware of that, of the big show going on. And people always ask, what about local politics? And I really can't give you an easy answer other than it really begins by identifying this Gnostic heresy that's really embedded in modern politics. It's really been decoupled from God. It's really become decoupled from natural law. And when you participate in it, it's got a direction to it that's bigger than you are. One side might be going a little faster than the other. And it is important to not become defeatist or nihilistic. There are plenty of ways we can engage, but I'll just finish, the level of propaganda in the news right now is off the chain. And this is where I get a little controversial. When we take stories at face value, when we should be knowing better that the politicians of the world lie to us over and over and over, that we should be able to identify that as the language of the serpent and just be a little bit hesitant to, going on the ride one more time. So there's a lot there, and and again, the show I'm doing, I'm looking forward to having this discussion today. He just paints how we, as traditional Catholics, this is not our space, this modern world. But how do you get back to Christendom? How do you attempt, as Gavin suggested, a type of work within kind of a type of modern integralism, which people can debate about that. So there are some answers. And it's simply a crisis in the church, and it's something that we do have to be aware of exists.
I just want to get back to that wonderful phrase you used, when politics is packaged in a Gnostic form, we have to get away from it. It seems to me that what we're trying to establish is a modus operandi for the Christian mind, for the Catholic mind, as we face politics wrapped up in a Gnostic form.
That's exactly. I would say that. That's great.
And so if that's the diagnosis, what's the prognosis? How can we do that? And I can see that the new what did you call it? I meant to write it down. Oh, techno-demonology. That was it. Fabulous phrase. So techno-demonology is coming at us as the face of politics packaged in a Gnostic form. And it's smuggling in a whole series of anti-God values. And where we meet it is in debate with the anti-God values. So gay marriage, euthanasia, abortion, birth control. These are all places where we find ourselves saying to the enemy, to the opposition, you're taking these values for granted. We don't believe you've even thought about them, actually. We think you've adopted them for utilitarian reasons, for convenience, for hedonism. But we're here to tell you, because we operate on the basis of revelation, special access to ethical knowledge you don't have, that A, you're wrong, and B, that if you implement them, they'll be to your harm. And that's why we find ourselves writing and speaking in the public space as we're faced with Gnostic presenting politics. But it's all about an argument about the values that get smuggled in, and every single value, every single ethic has to be debated for what it is. I think the difficulty is that too many, at least speaking for myself, the thing I have in the back of my mind is that I represent as a Catholic ancien regime that has been de-legitimized, and they think I'm trying to impose something old-fashioned on them. Yeah. And one of the things that I want to do, as I argue, is to slip that tackle, so to speak, and say, actually, no, you're the ancien regime. This is paganism coming at us. And actually, we've seen what happens when you impose these pagan values. A, they're demonic. B, they don't work. C, they're anti-God. D, they're anti-human. And we're coming once again to tell you yet again that if you don't wake up to working out where they came from, what their progeny is, they will destroy you. We're here to help you avoid destroying yourselves. And in that sense, what I want to do is to counter the myth of progress, which is how they put a soap under our feet. Always saying, we're on the right side of history, you're on the wrong side of history. So we have to slip that tackle to change the implicit language of ethical encounter that exists between the Catholic mind and the politics packaged in Gnostic form.
Yeah. I just think it's interesting listening to you, Gavin, and I'm sort of doing myself out of a job here, but I do have this tension in what you've just said there. You said a few things which began, we need to say, we must debate, everything has to be debated. And something I have tried to articulate, and I think, Doug, you do very well, and it's to do with you saying that we have to stay in the mystery.
This break is brought to you by Adobe Photoshop, featuring the amazing new text-to-image. Now you can create just by typing a prompt. So go ahead, whip up an underwater pink and purple coral wonderland. Get weird, get creative, and get your free trial at Photoshop.com. Is that the element, the principle, let's say the cosmic principle that is completely forgotten is femininity. And yes. I understand femininity to be mystery, silence, sacredness. Gertrude von Lefort describes femininity as that which the invisible, which gives integrity to all that is visible. And again, in the sacraments is the invisible made visible. So I suppose is some of what you're saying, Doug, and if so, I wouldn't disagree with it. And as I say, it's sort of doing me out of a job, that rather than we need to say this, we need to do this, we need to combat this, we need to debate this, if we all attended Mass daily, increased our prayer life, lived, participated in the sacraments, regular confession and so on, that I mean, ultimately the answer is the same. The answer is the same. No, because I suppose part of my question to you is how important is it that we understand all this? Because ultimately, however deep we understand or however shallow our understanding, all we need to know is that the answer is Our Lady's fiat is, let it be done to me according to your will, according to your word. And in the Our Father, thy will be done, is having the humility to just say, I can't combat this alone. I can't debate
someone out of this position. I can't say what needs to be said. I can. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm not. Yeah. I'm trying to say it's not that there isn't a place, as Gavin said, and I do it myself. We all do it, but I'm very aware of that tension where I feel like ultimately, for myself and the children God has given for us to direct to heaven, it's about living that reality.
Yes,
is the most important thing we can do.
Yes, I think that's a good way to pull things together. And before we have to engage as Catholics, that's part of what we do. It's part of tying together heaven and earth. We have a responsibility to do that. So just detaching is not a full answer, even though there's some, I want to address that though, we're in a unique time. But when you said our Blessed Mother, I'm a convert to Catholicism. And sometimes, for the month of December, I decided to do 2 rosaries a month. And what we do is each time we approach the Eucharist, our lives are a test here in this Valley of Tears. And each time we approach it, have we prepared ourselves? Do we truly believe? Are we so we're tested if we do Mass daily, that's the case. And when I do the rosary, sometimes I'm wondering, I meditate on the mysteries and I talk about that. And I had to go back and just the other day I made a video and I said, what exactly am I doing? Like, why am I talking about? So I just, it just providentially, it just jumped out on me. One way to look at this is we're sharing a gaze with the Blessed Mother. And she indeed, when we want to get back to reality, she's the cosmic feminine. And no, this sounds like New Agey, but she's the cosmic feminine that holds, there's always going to be a counterfeit of everything. So there might be an Ishtar or something, but she's the cosmic that holds this together. And when we share her gaze upon Christ, she, this is why, this is my link. She holds it all together for us. And so it's so precious that she is integral to this whole thing. It's absolutely integral. So that before we talk about politics or engage in the outside world, our family, we have to get our heads screwed on straight and get back to reality. And so if we can't get to Mass every day, that's what we're doing. It's just grounding us in just repetitive meditation that we need her. She's the cosmic force that holds us together. And starting with the Reformation, they said, you don't need her anymore. And it was really tragic. And modern Catholics aren't doing their rosaries every day because it just seems empty. Am I doing vain repetitions? We ask that. And when we go to Mass, am I really believing? Is my heart in this? And the part is, if we got to get back to that, that's the touchstone to reality. And the rosary helps us remain, in the sacraments and get our vision. And then we can engage properly and better understand the enemy and the Gnostic kind of spears coming at us. That said, when we talk about politics and all this stuff going along, some of this stuff, and I'm not trying to get to, rile people up. There's even another technology. Everybody's heard about the World Economic Forum and Yuval Harari and the metaverse and the getting under the skin. And it sounds like the mark. It's not that tragic to kind of maybe think these are unique times. I know it's everybody's thought that every century, but there's no harm because the apostles spoke as though it was, prepare yourself every day as though it was. But there's a new technology that just came out, as far as I know, I just heard about it. It's called Willow. And of course, the serpent is going to come in the end as a solution to the problem. And this thing is supposed to be like 10,000 computers in one, and it's going to be an answer to a lot of the world's problems and our personal problems. And maybe tomorrow it will be repackaged as something else. But a lot of this stuff is really coming on fast. So just beware, because we saw it over the last 5 years. All of the forces in the world. And in these last times, when we talk about language like the remnant and stuff like that, you have to be grounded in a historical, hierarchical, and sacramental reality each day. And that's the spiritual warfare that we're under. And so when we're grounded in that, when we can see stuff like, Christ did everything on the cross. We don't need any new solutions. We need to fight for freedom, for the rights of Christ. We need to protect ourselves. We need to protect our right to worship and these fundamental things. And those are under attack, and we need to stand up for them. Yeah. But there is a lot. This is what the book of Apocalypse, and maybe this is coming on later. There's a lot of forces, what we call the restrainer. That's exactly what this AI, this D-wave, this Willow is trying to do. They're going to call it quantum entanglement, and it sounds cool. It's just getting you as an empty vessel to be detached from the sacraments and open up to these spirits. So, I mean, I know, and there's politics to talk about in that, and it gets a little maybe crazy sounding for some people, but sometimes in these days we have to dare to sound a little fundamental in terms of our Catholic faith.
that horrible F word, fanatic. I mean, we should all be fanatics for Christ, shouldn't we? I just feel so sorry for people. Like love calls us to will the good of the other, and I feel really sad because this is where we might talk about the church. But I know, Doug, you'll come back on, so we might not cover everything today. But this is not to attribute blame, but there are innocent people who genuinely have been blinded to that cosmic hierarchy, have been blinded to the importance of Mary, have been blinded to our need for the sacraments, to the church Christ established and instituted, and they really are decent, small, insignificant, unnoticed people, and their souls are in jeopardy, their lives are in jeopardy because they have bought these lies. And this is where the church needs to step in. Not I mean, it's falling to lay people here and there, but the church, what has happened that the church has not made this abundantly clear? If we try and talk about ecumenism, it's never, people say you're sectarian if you want people to become Catholic. It's nothing to do with sectarianism. It's to do with one unity, one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And you can't find that by giving way to Protestantism or Islam or by compromising. That's not being hateful, but we're told that's being hateful and judgmental. And so, I mean, really, there's no question, just that I feel really sorry because for millions of people, it's not an intentional thing. They're not saying, I hate Jesus and I want to go my way. They really have been lied to and believe. And that's where I suppose that both and comes in. Both live and participate your faith and try to do your best by God's grace to elucidate that truth.
Yeah, and I think I might even just kick that over to Gavin because he spent, a lifetime in the Protestant world. When we try to bridge that gap, a quick response is the question: if people are saved, they're saved for the church, and that's part of us just doubling down on grounding ourselves in the sacraments. Our prayers, especially in these days, and the rosary is especially efficacious for the souls in purgatory and for others. But I'll let Gavin, there's a lot of great people that are Protestants that see things that Catholics don't. And it's part of, I think, just the crisis of our age. I don't know if you have a thought on that, Gavin.
One of my overall ways of looking at reality is to see things as having both a grace and a deviation. And each of those can be different at different times. I think there was a grace in Protestantism which sought to try and immunize more deeply Christian discipleship. But what it should have been is an add-on to what was already received. And what it became instead was a replacement of. And so, if you like, the grace-filled Protestant concern for an individual committed to Jesus became an alternative to our immersion in the mystical body of Christ. Yes. And our dependence on the Mass. And so what we need to do is not throw the baby out with the bathwater and say to Protestantism, you had a partial remedy to because the state of that we're always looking for partial remedy. We're always looking for renewal within the church, and there will always be a need for prophetic movements of renewal. But what they mustn't do is to be overambitious and to say that the
Cosas que me recuerdan a Latinoamérica. Preparar ceviche como mi mamá, ver partidos de fútbol con mis amigos y enviar dinero a casa con la app de Remitly, con cargos bajos y excelentes tipos de cambio. Remitly me ayuda a enviar más dinero a casa a las personas que amo. Baja la app de Remitly hoy mismo.
That the medicine becomes everything. And so in Protestant terms, that's what happened. and by repudiating through demonological seduction, by repudiating the Mass and repudiating Our Lady, they created a vacuum in which personal intimacy with Jesus became a heresy instead of a form of renewal. And so now I think the problem with Protestantism is that it's run its course. There isn't any form in which a Protestant view of Christianity can add anything to the crisis of these times, partly because, having repudiated the Mass and repudiating Our Lady, as you both have said, they've repudiated the capacity to balance matter and spirit. And as Catherine said, they've repudiated the invisible and the obedience of Eve, the second Eve, for the overt, the 18th century, the mechanistic, the scientific revolution. I think that's one of the reasons why, again, as Kathleen said, we're not. This is no new partisan denominationalism. What we're saying is that you mistook the nature of the medicine of the Catholic Church, and you need to receive the whole of it. So we need the renewed fidelity to Christ in our hearts, but set in a sacramental context and held in the embrace of our Mother. And the challenge that we're facing at the moment with this new Gnosticism and this techno-demonology can only be met by the Catholic Church. And so as a Catholic convert, one of the things I've been trying to say is I can so see that everything I learned from Protestantism hasn't the remotest chance of either understanding, diagnosing, or repudiating the heresies that we're getting at the moment. Only the Catholic Church is. And I think one of the things I want to help to do, I think, is to understand how, again, repudiating that separation of church and state that you began with, Doug, how we can try and formulate something substantial so we're not just criticizing the hedonism and the atheism. We're not just criticizing the ambition of techno-demonology. We're saying holding those things at bay within a Catholic viewpoint where matter and spirit are perfectly fused in Jesus and in the Mass. These are the implications of the way in which we might do our Catholic politics as opposed to your hubristic political theology.
Yeah. I'll try to comment on that. I think I liked what you just said in terms of where we're at, in terms of the spirituality of the world. My wife took a go at teaching religion class. My daughter's in 7th grade, and just the kids are just disengaged. I mean, she can't. And I remember when I was that age, you'd go to summer camp and, as a Protestant, and people would play the guitar and get huggy feely, and people older than you, they'd show you kind of a lived life of transformation. And then you'd go back to school and the Catholic kids would just not be into it. Right. And that's where you get these stereotypes from. And there's a real power. And I think that's in the charisma, in the felt experience, and to be a little footloose in terms of opening up the Bible and doing Bible roulette. And this is speaking to me and that kind of thing. But I think what you're suggesting is it's kind of run its course with the smoke machines and the mega churches and the jump up and down. And we see it running its course. And we see that in the spiritual age, much of it is just the blatant, it's beyond apostasy or heresy when a big bulk of it's believing we're going to get beamed up, or we're helping build the Antichrist system, or just some of these heresies, or we see the travesty going on in the Middle East and they're actually looking the other way and not doing it. We see the problems with that viewpoint and the extremes that it can fall into. So it's in front of us for a reason. This is being exposed for a reason. And fundamentally what's being exposed, because after a while people get tired of the guitars and the smoke machines, and they realize all of this was really just to disguise, which I believe ecumenism does. It's in the spectacle. It hides the enmity, but ultimately, and here's probably the little punchline: the charisma has always been there to hide apostolic succession. And that's the one thing that we have. And that's what people are, when people are seeing, they're looking at this faith, and I've been with the Calvinists and the Methodists and the Lutherans, and I did the smoke machine. And then suddenly they're prepared, their minds open for the paradigm, which is the Catholic Church. And people don't always identify it, but the magic is Christ breathed on the disciples, and that's still alive, and that miracle still comes before. When we really get excited and charismatic about that miracle and our lives become transformed over time, people will gravitate toward that. So we have to embrace the mystery in a way that's balanced with tradition and scripture, and get excited because this is the spiritual tool of our time. It's just that when we're lost in the spectacle and the language of ecumenism, we sometimes just miss the magic that is the Catholic Church, that despite all of the crisis in the church right now and all of the kind of hanky-panky with the Novus Ordo, God still allows us to see that, no, there must have been some kind of hermeneutic of continuity, because I will show you a miracle in that church. I am still alive. The gates of hell have not prevailed.
And the word that we need to put in there to people hang on is magisterium, because the magisterium is the living, continuing river that was released when our Lord breathed on the disciples. And in this environment of epistemological confusion, only the magisterium can only be found in the apostolic church. Apostolic succession has its, so it's ideologically what it is, but pragmatically we encounter it in the magisterium as the emanation of apostolic succession. And the reason that matters is because it's not to be found anywhere else. And as me as a Protestant, it was the absence of them. Not every crisis, so many of the crises I encountered required the magisterium as the solution. And it could only be found by returning to apostolic succession and this ongoing pneumatic growth of epistemological authenticity within the Catholic Church.
Holds together the unity of the image, and everything else, it's becoming parent. It's against the image, and it'll hold parts of that being together. The ontology still there, but it'll increasingly exhaust itself, and we're seeing that fall apart. And so the strange part, like this morning when I was doing my rosary, I tried it, and I just shared the vision of what our Blessed Mother must have been doing when her son was hanging on the cross. And I had this moment where she knew from the visitation that something special was happening. She was conceived from the Holy Spirit. She knew that something very significant was going on, but she didn't know at that moment, just like the devil didn't know, like how exactly, like, is he going to rise from the dead? She didn't know. And that's where we're at with the crisis of the church. It's like the boat on the water and the disciples losing their cool. And the crisis in the church right now only vindicates and verifies that this is the true church. This is the passion of the church. We need to look at this and turn it around and say, just glory be, here I am. And I'm gonna ride the boat out, and I'm gonna have faith that Christ, if he can rise again on the third day, he will come back and he will save us.
You gotta hear about this. Go from idea to illustration faster with generative AI.
Yeah. It's authority. I think it comes back to that rightful authority, and all that you've described there with the it's the flattening that we can end up with mega churches and pastors in ripped jeans and stuff. It's the flattening and the not recognizing that rightful authority. And we saw it when Pope Francis came in as well and said, let's get rid of Pope Benedict XVI's red shoes and all these things that actually have great symbolism pointing to the blood of the martyrs. And let's just I'll just ride a simple car. I'm a simple man. I'll wear simple white robes. And the mind that we have now says, isn't that more Jesus-like, more Christ-like? Isn't he a wonderfully simple man? Because of the mind that we now have, where in fact, the mind of our forefathers are going back through the tradition of the church is it actually, what it does is it does the opposite. It points more to the man and not to God. Whereas Pope Benedict had more of a recognition, I felt, that what he's doing in his office points to the transcendent. He should exist to point to Christ. That's his role. Whereas Pope Francis's efforts, and it's the same as, oh, look at the church has all this wealth. Why don't they sell it all and give it to the poor? And it's Judas, isn't it? And the balm. And you think, well, hang on, that church, that beautiful cathedral, that art, that is yours. That is mine. That is ours. What do you mean sell it into the hands of some rich, it's just such a strange way of thinking about these things.
I like what you just said a lot. And so I use the term because it really makes the modern man more comfortable. And as a kid, I would see the Pope and it looked just so bizarre. I
right.
grew up in a barren wasteland in the upper Midwest and say, what is that? But it's in the holy, and I'll talk about the Latin Rite. It preserves the visual economy that was Christendom. So in a micro fashion, we have all of the symbolic economy that takes us back to the beatific vision, and we, through the mystery, absorb ourselves back in that direction. When we leave that majesty, when we leave the hierarchy, the sacramentality and the historicity of that, we're getting into the image of man. So whether we're talking about the red shoes and all of this stuff, that's exactly what it does. So when we have the regalia and stuff like that, it helps keep us in the visual economy. And Christendom, the economy, the culture, the society, everything, the political regime, took all consciousness up. Modern political, everything is naturalized. And that's part of the unfortunate part of what you mentioned. It's just naturalizing and humanizing it. And we think maybe, like you said, I can identify with that. Like when a politician is being folksy, but we have a deep down desire to return to God. And the visual economy is road signs that help us do that. And we have to go back by having a faith, a simple, I said this last, almost a peasant kind of faith, that you can really be transformed by the icons, by the visuals, by the economy. But we have to shed ourselves and just get in a quiet state of mind and just allow the visuals that God gave us to work on us. And yes, so that was great that you brought that up.
Yeah, well, thank you, Doug. Let the visuals work on us. Gavin, you used a beautiful phrase just a few minutes ago. We need to be held in the embrace of our mother. And of course, our church is always referred to as she. Some people find that odd. Why are you calling her her? Why do we have a male priesthood? Again, mater e magistra, mother and teacher. And I think I'm the only cradle Catholic amongst us. And I don't say that as any kind of, to put myself above anyone, but I'm very aware, as we have discussions today, that I feel like I've always lived in mystery. I really recognize that as I was growing up, it wasn't so much about intelligibility as mystery. And I think that's formed who I am, whether I fell away from the faith or not. And I do think that it more perfectly aligns with reality, which is where we began. We began with what is real. So I think, Doug, we'll leave it there for now, but with the promise that you'll come back to us, because there are so many things that we've just touched on today that I'd like to have a discussion with you about in more depth. And Gavin, I'm sure you'll agree. There's a lot we can pull at here, isn't there?
I'm very struck by Doug recognizing and articulating the fact that some people see this and some people don't, and between those who do see it and those who don't are those who see it, a little bit of it. And I think what we're trying to do here is find the language that carry the perception that the three of us do have. And so the things that we want to talk about, I think, are things that in Doug's book that need a further unfolding. I think there are a lot of people who have a great sense that they're living through an earthquake and they can feel the ground shake under their feet. They can feel the seismic activity, but they don't know which direction the tectonic plates are moving in. And what I like very much about Doug's take is that he's given us a map that allows us to offer both a diagnosis and if it's not too pompous, a prognosis as well. So I think we certainly want to go on continually tugging at the diagnosis, because so many of the things we're dealing with as part of political theology or techno-demonology are always wrapped up in disguise, and it's unraveling the disguise that we need help with. Now we've established, if you like, the theoretical platform. We need now the praxis of unraveling the different disguises and applying to the deception, the insight and the discriminative diagnosis that we find in the mind of the Catholic Church.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Douglas Haugen, for joining us today, and I look forward to our next conversation. And between now and then, we'll finish this great book, and I suggest that you pick it up. You can go to Amazon, I guess, Doug. Pick it up there. Yeah. Maybe you might want to get it for somebody as a Christmas present. But we'll talk again, and thank you so much. And people can visit you at your own channel. We'll put some links below, so take a look at those and follow up with Doug's own work. But for now, thank you for joining us. I'm Catherine Bennett.
Thank you both.
I'm Gavin Eshonton. Doug, thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
It's different than the kind of acts of imagination that go